which is a very good way of introducing our speaker tonight, Jeremy Boudreau, who is the head of History of Art here at the Vinci of Florence, my esteemed colleague. Jeremy has been doing this job for 7 or 8 years now.
Almost 10.
Almost 10. I've only been here for 4.5 years, so I don't know what happened before. And he's been living in France for a long time as a graduate of the famous Syracuse program, originally from Rhode Island in the US of A, and a legend in his own lunchtime. So we'll pass the word now to Jeremy for his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. And welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back on the Wednesday cultural program to talk about a figure who I hope is going to be a crowd pleaser, Leonardo da Vinci. Assuming everyone here in the room has heard at least something of the existence of this artist, who is something of a paradox because he's one of the most studied artists of Florence and the Renaissance, and he's also one of the most enigmatic and puzzling. The talk that I put together today began with the idea that I would focus on his time here in Tuscany, his childhood in Vinci, as well as the first years of his training here in the Verrocchio workshop in Florence. But the PowerPoint kind of got out of control, and that happens with Leonardo because there's a lot of stuff to think about. What I'd like to do is talk a bit about the man, the myth, give you a brief survey of his career. I'm going to stick to paintings tonight because that's my specialization. I won't be going into any of the other many areas of his intellectual investigations, including natural sciences, hydrology, architecture, engineering. What I will do is stick to the paintings and the drawings and try to give you tonight a better idea of how we know what we know about Leonardo. It's been a very bumpy road since the Renaissance, trying to understand the historical assertions connected with the life and the career of this artist. But what I'd like to do tonight is give you an idea of who some of the major figures are that give us an understanding of his life and talk about the complexity of analyzing his works and his surviving records. The image of Leonardo comes to us in two forms normally. One as an old, bearded old man. I'm not going to put up the drawing attributed to Leonardo, which has been often proposed as a self-portrait of him because it looks like it's a portrait of a 100-year-old man, and we know that Leonardo died when he was 64. So I'm not putting that up on the screen. What I would like to put up is a drawing which we do believe with a fair amount of certainty is a representation of the artist produced by one of his assistants named Francesco Melzi. This is the drawing that we have on the right. And I'm contrasting that with another image, which is often proposed for a likeness or an appearance of Leonardo in his early years here in Florence, in the form of the bronze David cast by the Verrocchio workshop in the 1470s. So we've got this sort of idea of Leonardo coming to Florence as a teenager. Of course, his career takes off relatively quickly, and by the time he enters into his 40s, he is already known throughout the peninsula and throughout intellectual centers in Europe. And he will go on to live and work here in Italy, and ultimately for the last few years of his life in France in the service of the French king, Francis I. He dies there, he's buried there, his body remains there. Many of his works remain in France for this reason. And so what I'd like to do today is try to understand a bit of what happens in the life of this artist from the time that he arrives in Florence to the time of this great celebrity. The celebrity, I don't think, is anything that we really have to cover. If you go out to Vinci, which has a population of about 10 people, you're going to find monuments, you're going to find a museum, you're going to find indications that lead you to the birth home of Leonardo. We have contemporary sculptors in Italy that have celebrated his life and legacy through artworks such as Mario Ciroli, whose installation you can see here at Vinci. There is a similar artwork by the same artist installed permanently in the Rome airport. So even coming into the modern gateway of the country, we have an idea that this is an important figure for Italy and for Italy's history. How do we know about Leonardo da Vinci? Well, of course, we have his works, those that survive. We have works that were begun and left incomplete, known as partially completed works. We also have a number of studies, drawings, and copies produced by artists very close to Leonardo during his lifetime, working as assistants in his workshop in Milan. Many of them travel with him throughout his career to other Italian cities, two of them accompanying him even ultimately to France. We'll talk about them in a minute. And when we have the modern scholarship of all of these materials, it's of course an overwhelming body of material. The notebooks, the codices as they're known, the contracts that we find in some cases stored in the state archives of cities like Florence or Milan. When we think about the sources of what we know from the Renaissance, of course, that's something that we really need trained scholarship to go into archives, to transcribe old letters and documents, to bring them into a modern context so that a broader band of scholars and thinkers can peruse those materials and contemplate them. But what we also have is something of a legend of Leonardo, which is established during his lifetime and cemented in early biographies published shortly after his death. The earliest substantial information regarding Leonardo in the form of a biography comes in a section of a manuscript stored here in Florence known as the Anonimo Gaudiano, that has recently been attributed with a very good argument to the Florentine Bernardo Vecchietti. This is where we find, for example, references to some of the leading artists of the day, including Michelangelo, Andrea del Sarto. Seems that this is a man who knew many of these artists personally, and also goes on to write something about the rivalry engendered between Michelangelo and the older Leonardo. We have this as a sort of not an official biography, but the mentions of Leonardo travel far and wide, and certainly would have been known to Giorgio Vasari, who in the same decade of the 1540s is accumulating information for his ultimate publication of the lives of the most eminent painters, sculptors, and architects, first published in 1550, later expanded and republished 18 years later. In the life of Leonardo, which begins part 3 of the lives, ushering in the high Renaissance as Vasari sees it, he tells us something of the personality, the ability, and the awe that was inspired by Leonardo in many of his contemporaries. The introduction to the life of Leonardo, written by Vasari, begins this way. The greatest gifts are often seen in the course of nature, reigned by celestial influences on human creatures, and sometimes in supernatural fashion. Beauty, grace, and talent are united beyond measure in one single person, in a manner that to whatever such a person turns his attention, his every action is so divine that surpassing all other men, it makes itself clearly known as a thing bestowed by God and not acquired by human art. And here, Vasari seems to say something with conviction here. We have two ideas of how people can become great artists. How many of you have ever heard an expression along the lines of, if you don't succeed, if at first you don't succeed, try again? Have you ever heard the anecdote, practice makes perfect? What is the idea behind either of those expressions? We're not born with talent, right? If you've heard of God-given talent, for someone to be gifted, as if this is a power that's visited on them especially, this is something that Vasari seems to be getting towards in his introduction to the life, which attempts to chart out the development of Leonardo's career and trace him in his movements throughout Italy. That, together with other contemporary accounts, of course, the writings and the dates that survive in Leonardo's written notebooks and diaries, give us something of a clear idea of the career of this artist. And I wanted to go through that very quickly with you now to give an idea of the major works, many of them I'm sure you're familiar with here in Italy as well as elsewhere, but where they fall within this timeline, because we will see that the early years of Leonardo have a great impact in shaping the way that these works will eventually be created. Leonardo was born, as we know, in the small town of Vinci, which is just to the west of Florence, sort of in the area of Empoli. This is a town, again, that has remained quite small and undeveloped. There has been a great amount of attention visited on the town because it is the birthplace of Leonardo. We have, of course, identified the farmhouse in which he was supposedly born. This has been converted into something of a Leonardo museum, together with a larger civic palace in the center of the town. It is here in the neighborhood of Vinci that we also can attribute Leonardo's earliest drawings as having been presented. I'm going to stop until that phone is turned off. Is that off now? Okay. The first drawing that we can date to Leonardo appears to have been taken near the town of Vinci in the area of the Montalbano, this rise of hills that separates the valley of Florence from the area of the Fucecchio swamp and the downriver areas of the Arno River. This is one of the drawings which has encouraged many historians to assert that Leonardo was given something of an extraordinary education, even before arriving in Florence. He seemed to have been able to draw. He had a capability for draftsmanship in his early teenage years. It is understood that being raised for the first years of life in the house of his grandfather, that he was taught reading, writing, and calculation. He was, however, born illegitimately. And if you've heard this about Leonardo, that he was born out of wedlock, this is something that unfortunately caused problems for him, or more importantly for his father, in terms of trying to set up his son for a profitable career. He was not able to inherit the title of his father. He was not able to inherit the business or the property of his father. And so the placement of this young boy in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio here in Florence seems to have been one of the few alternatives for Ser Piero, Leonardo's father, to set up his son to make a living for himself. The works that were produced while Leonardo was an apprentice within the workshop, he quickly ascends to collaborator of Verrocchio, and those earliest works produced independently here in Florence are the ones that you can see here. You might be familiar, those of you here in the room, with the baptism attributed to the Verrocchio workshop, as well as the Annunciation attributed to Leonardo. These are both on display in the Galleria degli Uffizi. We also have the only Leonardo on display in the Americas, the early portrait of Ginevra de' Benci, produced roughly 25 years before the more famous portrait of the Mona Lisa. We have an enigmatic entry in one of Leonardo's notebooks that tells us in the year 1478, he began work on 2 paintings of the Virgin Mary. We are still unclear as to what works those are exactly. The closest to a consensus that has ever been arrived at is that those works described in Leonardo's own writings refer to the Madonna of the Carnation, or the Madonna del Garofalo, and the Benoit Madonna in St. Petersburg. The circumstances for the productions of these paintings will come back to a bit later in the talk. There is a work that is begun of St. Jerome, Penitent in the Desert, that is left incomplete, lost for centuries, rediscovered in the 19th century, gifted by its founder to, I forget which pope, entering into the paintings collection of the Vatican. That's what you can see here in the bottom corner. And of course, the work that is typically given emphasis for visitors and students of Leonardo when they come to Florence, the Incomplete Adoration, begun just a year before Leonardo sort of drops everything to head up to Milan to enter into the service of Lodovico Sforza in his court at the Sforza Castle. In Milan, of course, that work for the Duke is centered on an ill-fated project to produce a large equestrian monument in the honor of his father, Francesco Sforza. That never gets off of the ground, but he's busy with other things as well. If you've been to Paris or London and had a chance to view either version of the Madonna of the Rocks, these paintings were produced in Leonardo's first Milanese period, as well as important portraits of members of the Sforza court, including Lodovico Sforza's mistress, Cecilia Gallerani, as well as another more enigmatic portrait, which has not been, the sitter for which has not been identified with certainty, known as the Belle Ferronnier. There is, of course, the iconic fresco of the Last Supper, found in the refectory of the Church of Santa Maria della Grazia in Milan. And it is from here that we begin to see something of an itinerant period for Leonardo, brought on by the arrival of the Spanish and the French into northern and central Italy at the beginning of the Italian Wars. As he moves from Mantua to Venice, we know that he is welcomed to the court at Mantua by Isabella d'Este. We know that he is also employed briefly by the Venetian Republic to carry out several surveys and offer consultancy on how to best prepare the coastlines of the Venetian shores, as well as the entrances to the lagoon from the Ottoman Turks. We also know that it will be the increasing violence and political uncertainty in Lombardy. Leonardo probably thought he was hopeful to go back to Milan after a few years, realized it was not possible, decides to come back to Florence. It's in Florence, of course, that we have the production on his return as an established older artist of Florence, the production of the famous portrait of the Mona Lisa, as well as a cartoon produced for a commission for the Servites here at the Church of the Santissima Annunziata for a high altarpiece depicting the Holy Family, comprised of the Virgin, the Christ Child, the Baptist, and Mary's mother, Saint Anne. Another incomplete project begun by Leonardo, you might be familiar with if you've studied anything of Michelangelo, the important commission of the Florentine government to adorn the newly constructed hall of the Cinquecento, known as the Sala Grande at the time, with battle pieces commemorating historic Florentine victories and the expansion of the Florentine state. Michelangelo was commissioned to produce a drawing depicting one of the events of the Battle of Cascina, and Leonardo was commissioned to produce a battle piece depicting an historic victory of the Florentines at the Battle of Agnari. The work that Leonardo had produced on the wall of that sala is no longer visible. It likely no longer exists. There's a possibility that it is preserved under the workings and refurnishings of Vasari nearly half a century later. The appearance of what Leonardo had done in Florence in the Palazzo Vecchio survived through several copies produced in the early 16th century. When Leonardo returns to Milan, we see many of the drawings that had been devised in earlier periods brought to fruition in the form of completed paintings, not only authored by Leonardo exclusively, but produced with the collaboration of several hands of assistants in his workshop. And this is one of the problems that we have with Leonardo that is not exclusive to Leonardo. This is something of a normal practice and routine within Italian art of the late 15th century and the early 16th century. Large workshops employing students of all ages and abilities to assist the master in the production and consignment of commissioned works. We've got various hands at work on all of these sorts of paintings, so we can come back and take a look at a few of these and compare them to the drawings of Leonardo a bit later in the talk. He travels down to Rome after this, where he is able to, amongst other things, be encountered by Raphael once again. They had met in Florence earlier. He is, of course, featured supposedly as this personage of Plato in the philosophy fresco for the Stanza della Segnatura produced by Raphael in the first years of the second decade of the 1500s. And from here, accepts an invitation to travel to France. In France, he enters the service of the French king, Francis I, who you can see here in a portrait, together with a chapel that was constructed at the end of the 18th century to give something of a location for those wishing to go and sort of find Leonardo out in Amboise. He had been requested to be provided with a Christian funeral and burial within the Chiostro Grande of the Church of San Florentin in Amboise. That church was destroyed, so we have no idea where the actual grave or remains of Leonardo would be. This is sort of put up as a standing apology for all the pilgrims of Leonardo who traveled to Amboise looking for any evidence of his life there. So you can go and find this anachronistic chapel devoted to his death and the location of his death. There is something of an embellishment in the circumstances of Leonardo's death. Vasari himself would have you believe that Leonardo died nowhere else than the arms of the French king. We know that this is absolutely not true. This is actually a painting that was painted by Ingres, celebrating this mythology. We know that Francis I was miles away from Leonardo at the time of his death, but he was greatly upset to learn that he had lost this important courtier. And news of Leonardo's death spread very, very quickly from France to all of the cities of Italy. Upon his death in France, two of the assistants who had joined Leonardo early in the first years of his first Milanese period were able to inherit, essentially, directly from the artist and his workshop, many of his letters, his drawings, versions of his paintings that were either completed or incompleted. And it's from these heirs of Leonardo that we have something of the diaspora of the objects and the materials associated with the artist in the later 16th century and early 17th century. Here I'm showing you two portraits of the most important of these assistants and lifelong companions for Leonardo. Gian Giacomo Caprotti known by the nickname given to him by Leonardo, Salai, as well as Francesco Melzi. Francesco Melzi is represented here as a boy in a portrait by another of the members of Leonardo's workshop in Milan. He had entered into the workshop at the age of 10, as Salai had done about 17 years earlier. Both of these artists remained with Leonardo for the rest of his life. So 20 years, 30 years in companionship with the master. And it's for this reason that Leonardo left much of his materials to them. These materials are brought back to Milan. And here is where the problem starts, because of course, these materials have been disseminated. We have small booklets, we have notebooks. Leonardo is one of the earliest artists to actually travel with a pocket-sized notebook. If he ever had an idea that he wanted to write down, he would have something to jot down in. These are something of a pity to look at in reproduction because they never really give you a sense of the scale of these objects. But the notebooks like this that Leonardo would use are practically credit card size or wallet size. They have a small sort of latch here. You could open and keep them safe. Small pieces of paper to write on. Right? So we have some of the materials of Leonardo that really are contained in a format like this. There are other larger drawings and letters that have been subsequently compiled into codices, bindings, basically relining them in paper and putting them together in the clearest sense that was sort of made of them at the time. Some of those codices have been rearranged, but if you've heard of the Leicester Codex or the Atlantic Codex or the Foster Codex, these are the materials that we're talking about. Some of the notebooks are actually bound by Leonardo himself. Some of them have been assembled by art historians or those interested with those materials after his death. Here's an example of the inventory of Salai after Leonardo's death, returning to Milan, making an inventory of the paintings that he had brought back with him from France to Milan. And it's something of a problem because we see the Mona Lisa, we see the Virgin and St. Anne, we see all of these famous works of Leonardo. What is not clear from this inventory is whether they are the original works, whether they are other versions of the works produced within the workshop, whether they were copies of the works produced by Leonardo's assistants. And if you've been to any museum that wants to sort of boast any connection to Leonardo, we've got lots of copies of these works. There are copies of the Mona Lisa everywhere, not from the copies that we were talking about a month ago, but from contemporaries of Leonardo, often having to do directly with the practices of the workshop. Here's just an example of a famous work of Leonardo's in Paris today, the Madonna in St. Anne with the Christ child and a lamb. And I'm showing that together with two copies of the painting produced by these very same assistants. The Salai version of the Madonna in St. Anne is located in Los Angeles, and the Francesco Melzi version of the same painting is right here in the Uffizi upstairs. When we look at the drawings contained, surviving drawings contained in these codices, we can see very, very clearly how specific designs and ideas related to the execution of specific works of art. We can identify the hands, the sleeves, the drapery, the elbows, the positions of figures in Leonardo's paintings, often in this rudimentary form of the notebooks of the codices. We also have what are considered more formal studio cartoons, cartoons that were made in order to ensure and facilitate the work of apprentices in the completion of paintings, in the transfer of the cartoon to the support for a finished painting, or also the production of multiple copies. So this is something that most of the art historians concerned with the paintings of Leonardo have been doing for generations now, trying to link these mysterious objects, these paintings themselves that we have in museums throughout the world with individual references amongst the thousands of sheets of Leonardo's writings and records. This is just a 20th century bibliography. Everyone and their brother has studied Leonardo. Some of the contributions have been invaluable. Most of them, we could do just fine without. I'm sort of sticking with I think there's 100 biographies of Leonardo on the market today. I'll stick with sort of the art historical material because that's my area. But of course, we have to appreciate that Leonardo also enjoys something of a celebrity status beyond the realm of art history. This begins more or less in the early 20th century, even though the Mona Lisa, for example, had been on display in the Louvre since the French Revolution. It was not considered to be one of the most important paintings there. People had something of an interest for the larger works of Leonardo on display in the Louvre, and the Mona Lisa was something of a secondary thought in terms of a portrait of a young Florentine woman. That's all going to change when we get to the first years of the 20th century. And again, as these writings of Leonardo are made available to scholars and his penmanship, his notes are slowly, very laboriously transcribed and translated, we have now access beyond the paleographers, right? We have people that can read the notebooks of Leonardo without having to be trained in Florentine paleography, reading this kind of reverse penmanship. We've got transcripts now, so we can go to them, we can read what historians have put together based on their study of the documents themselves. And this was conducted by none other than Sigmund Freud in the early 20th century, who produced something of an early psychoanalytical profile of Leonardo based on the writings of these notebooks and the psychoanalysis of his famous works of art. The title of the work is Leonardo da Vinci and the Memory of His Childhood. And of course, he tries to visit on the works of Leonardo together with the limited knowledge of Leonardo's childhood and upbringing, something of a psychological identity. It was Freud who suggested that this mysterious smile of the Mona Lisa, whose identity was still something of an open question in the early 20th century, was reminiscent of the memory of the smile of Leonardo's mother, Caterina. We know that Leonardo was born illegitimately. It was held by tradition that the mother, the biological mother of Leonardo, was a simple farm girl from the area of Vinci. And after having delivered the child was essentially brought into the household of the father, who was of much higher station, a successful notary operating already here in the city of Florence for the Medici, amongst other clients. And that the mother was basically set up to marry another peasant. She sort of had her own life, and Leonardo was raised by his grandfather. When he came to visit his father in Florence, his stepmother was here. They eventually failed to have a child. This first wife dies. It will be a second wife of the father that eventually will give him 4 children. The first of these half siblings is born when Leonardo is already 24. So we don't have to worry about siblings while he's a child. He doesn't really have access to a large family network. It seems like he's being raised by his grandparents. He also does have a teenage uncle named Francesco, who's out in Vinci in these earliest years of his life. So he tries to look into these paintings and try to understand if the specifics of Leonardo's upbringing, the structure of his family could have an impact on the way that he produced portraits of women. Of course, this idea of one's relation to one's mother is a big part of the thesis of Freud and psychoanalysis, right? And there is also something of a comment written by Leonardo in 1505 that really gets Freud excited. Basically, it's a recollection of a childhood memory or a dream that Leonardo has. It's located in the Codex Atlanticus. And I'm giving you here the proper translation. After writing a bit about the flights of birds, he's sort of gone through pages and pages of writing about these birds, and that he was looking at kites in particular. And he wrote, this writing is such a distinct manner about the kite seems to be my destiny, because in the first recollection of my infancy, it seemed to me that while I was in my cradle, a kite came to me and opened my mouth with its tail and struck me several times with its tail inside of my lips. Freud goes off on this comment because it's really the only recollection that we have in all of these notebooks of Leonardo referencing early childhood. He doesn't talk about his childhood. There's no real mention of his biological mother, no real mention of the circumstances out in Vinci. So Freud understandably sort of zooms in on this very valuable piece of information offered by the artist himself. And what he does with this in the publication is something of an unfortunate mistake in translation. Basically, the German translation of the notebooks and the codices made available to Freud had a mistranslation of the bird described by Leonardo. You can see in the translation, in the original text here on the bottom, that it is a nibio, the word that we have for kite, which is used by Leonardo in his notebook. That was mistranslated to the German word for vulture. And so Freud back in 1910 is reading about Leonardo's childhood crib being invaded by a vulture who's whapping the inside of his mouth with his tail. He goes off on this whole tangent about the symbology of vultures from antiquity, Egyptian hieroglyphics, the mother goddess with the head of the vulture, all of the sort of idea that this has something to do with this circumstance of being taken from his mother, being brought into another home. One of his early disciples, Oscar Pfister, actually sees within the painting of Madonna and Saint Anne the form of a vulture in the blue robes of the Virgin Mary. Freud, adopts this and says, yeah, that's great, right? Of course, it's going to be something of an embarrassment when it's pointed out by an English art history student that there's a mistranslation to this. And in fact, vultures and kites are entirely different birds. Why was Leonardo so obsessed with the flight of kites in particular? Well, he also would have been knowledgeable of the stories that are associated with these animals from ancient sources such as Aesop's fables. We also have medieval versions of bestiaries, which give something of a personality or a story or an anecdote behind various animals found in nature. We also, of course, have ancient writings that have been, at this point, translated into the Vulgate. And so Leonardo would have known that, for an example, I believe it's Pliny who tells us that it is the actual maneuvering of the tail of the kite, which makes it such an agile flyer, that inspired the first sailors to invent rudders for ships. So he's looking very closely at these animals because there's something of a credit already given to them for being an inspiration for scientists in understanding dynamics and all these sorts of things. Not vultures, right? So a very, very different sort of idea from what had inspired Freud. But this is what's going to add to something of a mass popular interest in Leonardo. It doesn't help that a year after the publication of Freud, the Mona Lisa in Paris itself was stolen. It was stolen by the Italian Vincenzo Perugia. It was missing at large for about 2 years, right? I don't think it ever left the vicinity of the Louvre. It was sort of hanging out in a Parisian apartment all that time, was eventually restored. But this was the first example of an art theft that had really captured global attention. Films were made about this art theft, songs were written about this art theft, and the popularity of the object itself and the legacy of the artist in general explodes from this period onwards. The object has been sampled by artists from the post-war period onwards, right? We think about the sort of return to these great Renaissance icons by postmodern artists. We've got our share. There is also something of a lingering mystery involving the sitter and the identity of the woman represented in the portrait known as the Mona Lisa. Mona Lisa, of course, is the name that we use in English to refer to an identity offered already by Vasari that the figure of the Mona Lisa was the wife of the Florentine merchant Francesco del Giocondo. Her name was Elisabetta Gherardini, and from an important family, ancient line here in Florence, with properties also out in the area of Greve. And that painting was never consigned to the family. It was kept by Leonardo, traveled with him to Milan and eventually to France. It was given basically to the King of France as a gift, and for that reason is found in the Louvre today. Not one of the Napoleonic plunders, but an early story of an object really being brought to France by Leonardo himself. There has been a big question here. Who is this figure? Is it a figure of Gherardini, Giocondo's wife? Is it someone else? Is it a self-portrait? Is it a portrait of one of Leonardo's male assistants dressed up as a woman? Who are we looking at when we look at this picture? It seems that the argument has been, for the most part, put to rest because a document was found not too long ago in a book in the University of Heidelberg that was recognized to be the personal copy of a printed version of Cicero that was owned by the Florentine Agostino Vespucci. And in the margins of this particular printed volume, we have a text comparing, first of all, Leonardo to Apelles, and also telling us here that at this time, and this is dated in the year 1503, Leonardo is working on a painting of the wife of Francesco del Giocondo. So that should seem to put the story to rest, right? We're looking at the person who we think we're looking at. Whether or not this is the painting that is in the Louvre today remains a question that we can never answer. But it's this sort of idea, right, of the obsession with these stories that has inspired artists, has inspired the general public. And there is, I think you can all remember the adieu made back in 2019 for the anniversary of the death of Leonardo. We had exhibits sort of everywhere. We also have something of a return to understanding this genius through museums devoted to technological and didactic displays. They're popping up in every major city in Italy at this point. We have film and television adaptations of the life of the young Leonardo, who's coming out of the woodwork once again. And we also have advancement in the scholarship itself. And we have something of a funny example that I wanted to share with you tonight, a recent publication, which is not a study per se, it's something of an historical fiction written by the Italian scholar Carlo Vecchi. And this book, Il Sorriso di Caterina, la madre di Leonardo, or The Smile of Caterina, the mother of Leonardo, attempts to construct a fictive history and identity, the identity of the biological mother of Leonardo. And this was inspired by the discovery of several documents here in Florence in the State Archives that tend to give light on the identity and, more importantly, the status of Caterina, the mother of Leonardo. The first is found in a family register, or zibaldone, of the great Florentine Francesco Castellani. This is an ancient noble Florentine family. It is the Palazzo Castellani that houses the Accademia della Crusca and the Galileo Museum right next to the Uffizi on the river. It is a family that was one of several in the city to already employ Ser Piero, Leonardo's father, as a notary. And when I say notary, I want to sort of specify what that means back in the Renaissance, because sort of everybody's a notary today. But if we think about that role back in the Renaissance, it's almost equivalent to something like a modern corporate attorney. We know that Ser Piero worked for religious institutions, civic authorities, and bodies of the Florentine government, as well as private citizens. And the Castellani are one of these families here in Florence. And there is a document which tells us, basically in the hand of Francesco Castellani, that he has taken for his daughter, who has just had a child, a balia, or a wet nurse. And that wet nurse was the slave and property of a Venetian family. And her name was Caterina. And that, together with a document written in the hand of Leonardo's father, Ser Piero, in his notary account book, basically tells us something more that we believe is connected to the same figure. And that is that Caterina, daughter of Jacob, slave or servant, who came from Circassia. And so this is a very specific description for someone that doesn't have a last name, right? Caterina di Jacobi. Who is this person? Well, she's either a servant or a slave from Circassia. If you're noting this penmanship, Leonardo, it's not backwards, but I mean, I think we can see where Leonardo got his penmanship from. The father doesn't have, beautiful penmanship here. But this reference to a slave that was sort of brought into Florence from this area, from beyond the Black Sea, probably through the Venetian trading port of Tana, via Constantinople to Venice, and then down to Florence, was something of an inspiration for this writer and historian who wanted to learn more. They've actually identified another document in the hand of Ser Piero, which appears to be the recording of the liberation of this slave. And this slave, Caterina, is freed of servitude several months after the birth of Leonardo. So the question remains, was Leonardo yes, he was born illegitimately, but was his mother a slave? Did his father accidentally impregnate the wet nurse of a Florentine client, then had to take responsibility for his actions in terms of taking the child, liberating the mother, sort of finding that mother a husband out in Vinci? This is all sort of speculation, but what is suggested by these documents is elaborated beautifully in a recent publication, and I've just donated a copy of this book to the library today, a gift from my department to the library. It is in Italian. I'm not sure when there's going to be an English translation, but if you are fluent in Italian, I've got it here if you'd like to take a look. This book attempts to reconstruct something of a fictive but historically tenable journey of this young Circassian woman from the Black Sea to Tuscany. The time that Leonardo had spent out in the countryside, again, we're told by Vasari as well as others that this instilled in him a love of nature, a love of the natural world, a love of elements that he's able to observe out there. And it was something of a dramatic change to his life to be brought into the city of Florence. I believe this is because of the death of his grandfather, and that sort of care is no longer available in Vinci. The child is old enough to be brought into Florence. Some people believe that Leonardo could have been brought here as early as 1466. We have documents attesting to the presence of Leonardo already as a member of the Confraternity of St. Luke here in Florence by 1472. And we also have records of his participation within the Verrocchio workshop. Andrea del Verrocchio's workshop was one of the most important in the city. Here is one example for those of you here in Florence that you might be able to recognize easily walking down the streets, the famous Doubting Thomas and Christ group from the niche at Orsan Michele. He is first and foremost a sculptor. This is first and foremost a sculpture studio and workshop, but he also takes on impressive feats of architecture and engineering. And at the time that Leonardo arrives in Florence, one of the major projects occupying the Verrocchio workshop is the casting, soldering, and hoisting into place of the massive orb that adorns the top of the lantern of the Florentine, of the cupola of the Florentine cathedral. There's actually a painting produced around the same time. It is a representation of Tobias and the angel, I think, but we have something of a background detail here in the landscape, which shows the city view of Florence with these wild scaffolds set up all around the cupola. So this is the sort of thing that is confirmed when we look at writings and entries into Leonardo's notebooks written years later. This is one coming from 1515, in which he's trying to work out something having to do with casting and soldering. And he makes a note to himself that says, remember how they did that when we were working on the orb for the cathedral. Remember how that solution was come to, how we had to join those pieces together. So he's sort of thinking back to his early training. At this time, he's a teenager, right? But he's not sort of hoisting the orb himself, but he's drawing on those early experiences later in his career. Let's also appreciate that the Verrocchio workshop was packed full of some of the most talented artists who will go on to sort of chart the course of Italian art in the next century. Lorenzo di Credi, who essentially was the chief assistant of the Verrocchio workshop, inherited that workshop together with most of the materials that were in it. Sandro Botticelli studied in this workshop for a time. Pietro Perugino, Pietro Vannucci, the Perugian, Domenico Ghirlandaio, and Leonardo. And so just to sort of give you an idea of the interactions that Leonardo would have had in this workshop, he's always sort of grouped together with Michelangelo and Raphael. And we hear about this great triumvirate of high Renaissance artists, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Well, the teachers, or the masters, if you like, of Michelangelo and Raphael, Ghirlandaio and Perugino respectively, are students of Leonardo. He really is of that generation that's a bit ahead of Leonardo and certainly the young Raphael. So this story of working not only under the guidance of Verrocchio, but also interacting with apprentices and assistants within this workshop is something of the fuel for Leonardo, not only as he launches into his own career, but also as he begins to amass a workshop himself and oversee the work of assistants, beginning most importantly in his first Milan period. Here is the bronze David attributed to the workshop, which is often suggested to have incorporated the young Leonardo, perhaps at the age of 15 to 18, as the model for this work. That was common practice for the time, to have apprentice sort of, drop their paintbrushes, put on a gown, sort of step up on the box and sort of pose, for a figure being represented in a painting, perhaps to even have casts made for something of a casting of a statuary figure. And we also have, of course, the famous story of Leonardo's involvement on one of the paintings produced by the Verrocchio workshop. And that is the baptism on display in the Uffizi today. I'm showing that together with an academic painting, which gives us an idea of the sort of universality of the story, which is handed to us by Vasari. And that story is that while this baptism is being sort of worked on in the workshop, the head of the shop has got so much to do. Verrocchio's got projects everywhere. He doesn't have time to work on this painting. He doesn't really consider himself a painter anyway. He sees whether or not some of the younger boys can start working on areas of the painting to get the progress and the completion moving along. And that Leonardo, as a boy, painted the angel in the lower corner of the painting. This is a painting, again, made in the 1800s to give us an idea of a bewildered Verrocchio kind of coming into the workshop and looking at this beautiful angel on the painting that this little boy had made and saying, oh, well, I'm never going to do any of the paintings for this workshop again. You're my number one painter. I'm ashamed at how well you've done. This makes everything else in the painting look terrible. I'm not sure if that's how much truth there is to that. But when we do look at something like this painting against the sculptural output of the studio, we get an idea that there are many hands at work. I mean, if we had to try to link these figures stylistically to one another, it's kind of hard to do. Even scientific investigation of this painting shows that there are areas of the surface that were painted with different media. And while most of the painting was completed in tempera, the area traditionally ascribed to Leonardo, as well as areas of the background, the riverscape, and the sfumato modeling of the flesh of Christ in the center, has been passed over with a combination of tempera and oil. And it's in part this sort of early adoption of a new technology, really, sort of oil, to be given over to subtle modeling and shading in painting that hasn't really sort of set in yet in Italy. Leonardo, together with Antonello da Messina, are the two great popularizers of oil painting here in Italy. But there seems to be an early investigation into those materials. The first official commission from Leonardo is the famous Annunciation, which is also on display in the Uffizi. And this is a work that we know was something of a statement for Leonardo, that he had arrived, that he had matriculated out of this training program. He was a member of the Confraternity of St. Luke. He was a registered professional painter, but he wanted to show his debts and everything he had learned, basically studying in the workshop of Verrocchio. So here you can see studies of the drapery that we've connected to the execution of this painting. It seems that the architecture, and in particular the shaping of the sculptural bookstand on which Mary's prayer book is placed, seems to derive directly from the tombs recently completed by Verrocchio over at San Lorenzo for the Medici mausoleum of the old sacristy. You look here at some of the details. And of course, even something like the wings on this angel, looking much more like the wings of a bird than the wings of any angel depicted in medieval or early Renaissance art. We have the enigmatic portrait of Ginevra de' Benci, produced in a similar context to that of the Mona Lisa, although much earlier, completed supposedly in 1474. And this is a work which is something of a strange object because it is contains both a recto and a verso. It's a two-sided altarpiece. It appears to have been cropped. We have something of a square format, which is very strange for portraiture at that time. It's been suggested that the lower section of this painting was removed at some point, and that lower section most likely had something of a placement of the hands of the sitter in either holding a nosegay or a bouquet, some sort of object which would certainly attest as an attribute to her purity, to her chastity, to whatever, if we want to sort of compare this to other works associated with the workshop of Verrocchio or some of the studies that survive from Leonardo's notebooks. This is how we start to put dates on the drawings, right? There is a story that just after the consignment of the portrait of Ginevra de' Benci, that there is an anonymous claim filed at City Hall here in Florence that Leonardo, together with 3 other men, were charged anonymously, again, accused of sodomy and the sexual violence of a young Florentine 17-year-old named Jacopo Saltaretti. He was the member of a family of goldsmiths and had worked in a shop nearby to the Verrocchio studio. The Leonardo scholars, with relief, will tell you that nothing ever came of this. He was quickly acquitted. Nothing ever really happened. But this has been a document, again, not in the writings of Leonardo, but within the state archives, that has given many a confidence to comment on the sexual orientation or identity of Leonardo da Vinci. The final sort of period in which Leonardo is here before making his way off to Milan, we see that there is also some turbulence in local politics. And if you've heard of the Pazzi conspiracy, which culminated in the assassination of Giuliano de' Medici, nearly killing Lorenzo de' Medici, that had happened just a few years before. One of the major perpetrators of this conspiracy, Bernardo Baroncelli, had fled the city. He was caught up with by Florentine forces in Constantinople, dragged back to Florence, summarily executed, and his body was sort of thrown out the window for all to see. Leonardo was here. He actually makes a drawing of this Florentine corpse hanging outside of City Hall, together with notes. I don't know if he wants to make a painting of this later, but he sort of has these really weird notes about this guy sort of hanging by his neck. And he's sort of commenting on the beauty of the garments and the fur and the hose and everything else that this guy is wearing. So you've got these sort of funny things that we've got in these notebooks, and as you start to pore over them, you start to find interesting sort of Easter eggs, if you like, as we call them today. This is a drawing in which we have a bit of reverse writing here. If I was to sort of put that into the right way to read, if you could read Italian, you might be able to make out some of these words. We're not sure, some month ending with VRE, Settembre, Ottobre, Novembre, Dicembre, I'm not really sure, sometime in the autumn, right? Of the year 1478, I began the 2 Virgin Marys. Obviously, pictures we're talking about here. Which pictures are we talking about? Again, traditionally, we are thinking either about the Madonna del Garofalo in Munich or the Benoit Madonna in St. Petersburg. But there has been an interesting theory proposed recently that at least one of these Madonnas mentioned is a work that was never completed, but survives through many, many drawings and preparatory sketches, so much so that it's known by a title, even if the object doesn't exist. And that title is the Madonna of the Cat. And here we have drawings by Leonardo, which show from this time period that he is working with all different ideas of how to position the figures of the Virgin Mary, the Christ child, and a cat. This is actually this is the 2 sides of the same piece of paper. It looks like Leonardo had worked on one composition, then maybe held it up to the window and traced it to work out a similar composition on the opposite side. We have drawings in which the child and the cat alone are sort of studied in a variety of positions. Bear hugs, sort of pets here. It looks like in some cases a bit of strangling of the cat. And people think, we have more drawings that we can connect with this non-existent painting of Madonna of the Cat than we have paintings that we can for sure connect to the Benoit Madonna or to the Garofalo Madonna. So, this must be one of the paintings that he's talking about, right? And in fact, when we look at some of the copies, again, important to look at copies made by the assistants and the sort of collaborators of Leonardo, because they are actively encouraged to produce multiples of these works of art. One that doesn't even have a certain attribution, either Cesare da Sesto or the Spaniard, Fernando Ibáñez, produced this painting, which is in the Brera today, and radiography has revealed that there is actually a drawing of a cat underneath the lamb being held in the picture. So again, what is this thing about the cat? there's sort of a legend that there was a cat born at the moment, the same moment that Christ was born. And I'm not sure if that's anything canonical, but it's something of a popular tale that's around at the time. There are cats in other representations of religious art. They're not really ever found in Nativity or Madonna and Child. So it's something of a strange topic that has interested many scholars. And the more information we uncover about this non-existent painting, maybe that's a painting that has still yet to show up at some point in modern times. And that could be completely understandable. The last two works that I'll share with you are the incomplete St. Jerome, just found in the Pinacoteca, Paintings Gallery of Vatican today. This is a work that was begun here in Florence. We don't know what happened to it. It was discovered in, I think, the late 18th century in Rome, cut up into pieces. I think part of the panel was used as the seat of a stool in a local artist's workshop. The work was identified, reassembled, and if I show you a picture of this painting under the glare, you might be able to see that the head itself was entirely cut out. So this thing was cobbled back together again before being presented to the pontiff and entering into the collection. So maybe there is a Madonna of the Cat still out there somewhere. Maybe it's behind the sofa in a Florentine palace or villa. We're not really sure. Of course, this idea of works being left incomplete by Leonardo is part of the fascination with the artist, the great work that was extended to him for the Church of San Donato a Scopetto, the Annunciation, is a masterpiece. It's one of the most important paintings that we have in the Uffizi. It's considered by many to be the painting that ushered in the High Renaissance itself. So it doesn't need to be finished, right, to be a work which is valuable to us in understanding this artist or the time that he lived in. If we compare this to contemporary works, well, I'll show you one that was eventually produced once Leonardo left town. This is by Filippino Lippi, to replace the work that Leonardo had never managed to finish. But we have looked at the painting itself, again, because it looks like it was painted over historically. It wasn't really certain what was the work of Leonardo, what was maybe overpainting. A recent restoration has removed much of what is believed to have been the historic overpainting on this object. And today, the painting looks more like this, going into the, it's a dramatic change from, remember this painting from before the restoration. The tones are quite different, but this has revealed many of the details in the drawings on the panel itself. And it has been the sort of increased visibility of the details of this painting that have led some scholars to believe that we actually have something of a connection found in a similar painting produced by Botticelli, the so-called Dell'Ama Adoration, which is also upstairs in the Uffizi, produced around this time that Leonardo was sort of, getting ready to leave for Milan. And the similarity of one of the figures here in the group of onlookers in Botticelli's Adoration seems to have a striking similarity to one of the figures of Leonardo's famous and complete Adoration. And so it's been proposed that perhaps Botticelli, in admiration of his colleague from the Verrocchio workshop, included a unidentified portrait of Leonardo, not a 15-year-old boy, not a 150-year-old man, but a sort of 20-something-year-old burgeoning artist about to begin his career in a new city. This, I think, is probably a good point to stop, because, of course, if we go on to something like Milan and sort of, being sent up there and meeting the Sforza and all the artists up there, I think we'd be here all week. So it will be after this simple trip in which he's sent by Lorenzo the Magnificent to deliver some instruments to the House of Sforza that he begins seeing the opportunity to establish a career for himself there under the auspices of the Sforza. And the last document that I'll show you is the draft of a letter written by Leonardo after seeing events and figures of the Sforza Castle during his first visit. He writes out a letter to the Duke in which he says all the things that he can do. And he says, I can make machines for you. I can reinforce your castles. I can dig tunnels under bridges. I can construct weapons that will, can be used in a sea battle. And he goes through all these sorts of things, almost sort of selling himself as a military advisor. And then there's something of a postscript or an afterthought. The last item, on the very bottom of the page is, oh yeah, I can also do sculpture. I can paint. I can do all these kinds of things. And it would be a really great idea, don't you think, if I came up and maybe put a horse, an equestrian monument up in memory of your father? Wouldn't that be a good thing for you to do, right? Your money, my talent, let's get this going. This is essentially the impetus to bring Leonardo away from Florence. And the rest, as they say, again, with sort of no time left, is history. He's on the money today. I'm hoping that you've enjoyed that. I can't answer questions about Leonardo very well because he's sort of a universe into himself. But I'm hoping that you've enjoyed this presentation, looking at some of the aspects of his life, his training, and his work. And if you do have questions, I'll try to the best of my ability, but no promises. Thank you.
Well, I feel breathless. A wonderful, wonderful tour de force. Do you know what I mean? I feel you could have gone on for another 2 hours if we let you. But wonderful energy, and I love the way you go down different rabbit holes and find ways out again, and all connects up.
This is what we do every afternoon in that classroom. If you want to,
For sure, yeah. It's a little trailer for the, it's Renaissance Month starting in May.
That's right.
So there we go. As always, we will of course do questions and answers, and if you're on the Zoom, you can. Oh, there we are. There's Zoomers. You can either unmute yourself and talk to us. We'd love to hear your voices, or we put it up on the chat, and I'll read it out on your behalf. And if you're in the room, just put your hand up, and I'll bring you the microphone. So, anyone want to go first? We're at stunned silence. See if there's anything coming up on the chat. Okay. Here from Kim Gottlieb Walker. We've seen Leonardo's illustration of the hanging Pazzi conspirator. Does he ever mention the Pazzi conspiracy or the murder of Giuliano de' Medici in any of his writings?
I don't think so. I don't think that there's any sort of account about that in Leonardo's notebooks, but they are sort of digitalized today. So I guess we could kind of figure that out if we've got them all in a couple of volumes. We could search for Giuliano and see what comes up. Not to my knowledge.
Is it true that Lisa was living in Via Maggio, just around the corner? As I heard
Lisa Gherardini.
No, sorry, Mona Lisa.
Mona Lisa.
Yeah.
Lisa Gherardini. So the wife of Francesco del Giocondo. The name in Italian is La Gioconda, Le Gioconde in French, which is in part kind of a feminization of the name of her husband. It also is essentially communicating the meaning of being jovial or smiling or sort of playful or pleasant. So that family had properties here in Florence. I'm not sure if it was on the Via Maggio specifically, but there are several residences that we have here in which the owners claim that it is their villa, their apartment, that was the location in which the portrait was made. The strongest or most likely claim comes from the villa of Vigna Maggio out in Gravina County, which was a Gherardini property. And we know that Leonardo was hosted by that family. What people have been trying to do is go to these places and look out the window and see if the landscape matches the painting. But Leonardo doesn't really seem to use landscape to that effect. He's not using landscape as a document of the place in which the sitter is sitting. He's using the landscape in another form of visual language to sort of the universe, the atmosphere, the world itself. There's all kinds of things happening within those landscapes. If you looked at the geography of the backgrounds of the Mona Lisa or either of the versions of the Madonna of the Rocks, there's very interesting stuff going on there. I don't think you're ever going to find that background behind the Mona Lisa anywhere here in Tuscany. But people claim, this is my window, this is where she was.
If you look around on Airbnb, I'm sure you could rent an apartment which was authenticated where Mona Lisa used to live. So yeah. We got some more on the Zoom. And in a moment, Brenda, I'll come to you, but we'll just read out a couple. Stephen Baisby, as someone who has worked through 3 of those 20th century biographies, how much did the 1966 flood contribute to the seeming flood of documents historians now rummage through? So
I think most of the work was done before the flood, and even in the 19th century, when we have the bindings of the major codices, particularly the Atlanticus is the one that has the most largest amount of writing regarding some of his non-artistic endeavors, engineering, water direction, these kinds of things. And those were put together at the end of sort of in the second half of the 19th century. So I think that the early translations are pretty much out there by by the end of the 1800s. I'm not sure if the flood, if anything, the flood would have ruined things that we already looked at, but nothing really comes out of that other than a big mess. In fact, when you look at the holdings of the State Archives in Florence, as well as the National Library, if you go to their catalogs, there's a whole sort of column, you know, if things were flooded or not. You know, can I consult this volume? You know, was it in the flood? Is it still on the shelf, or is it sort of in a deposit somewhere? So if anything, the damage caused to the archival holdings in Florence in 1966 would have, at least for a substantial amount of time, limited access to volumes while they were being restored. I don't think that would have helped in any way. But if anyone knows otherwise, please let me know. He never married, he never had children. And the sodomy charge would seem to reinforce the idea that he was homosexual. I mean, yeah, it's also a really easy way to get someone in trouble if you don't like them. You know, anonymous charges of you know, scandalous behavior, especially sexual behavior in the Renaissance, is a political tool that was meted out to many people. Nothing happened. You know, one of the other figures who was charged together with Leonardo was Leonardo Tornabuoni. Right? He's sort of a family that had, in the previous generation, sort of formally unified with the Medici via marriage. So, I mean, you know, if you're going to sort of give Leonardo a problem, you're going to give other people a problem. His father's a notary. I mean, I have a feeling like this could have been smoothed over. Whether it happened or not, it would have been smoothed over, and these young men would not have faced real dire consequences. If it had been a sort of a false claim, it would not have been the only account. So I think also when they sort of received these complaints, they take them, you know, they don't take them more seriously than they have to. When it comes to his sexual identity, I think it's important to say that in the Renaissance, people aren't thinking as much about sexual identities as sexual actions and behaviors. There is something of a long and very sort of tender relationship that's developed between Leonardo and Salai. And then 17 years later, another young boy, Francesco Melzi, enters into the workshop, and he, like Salai, stays with Leonardo till the end of the artist's life. So there are, you know, potentially companionships, you know, within that professional network of the workshop. It would not have been exclusive for Leonardo. That we can imagine would have happened in workshops throughout Florence, throughout Italy at the time. He seems to have wanted to not communicate that about himself publicly in any way. He was very reserved with his private life and kept very much to himself on matters of love and everything else. But if you want to get into that kind of stuff, you know, that new television series that came out a couple of years ago was pretty smutty. I think they're focusing on that kind of stuff. So check it out.
Right. Before we let Brenda speak, I'm just going to ask Sarah to put up the link to help the Zoomers to make a donation if they so feel inclined. So Brenda, speak to us.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for that lovely lecture. I was in Bobbio before Christmas, and the story there was that the background, the two different backgrounds to the Mona Lisa was actually created in Bobbio, that he finished the Mona Lisa in Bobbio. Now, I don't know how true this is or not. Do you have any information about that, or is that just a claim?
What I've heard is that there are several drawings of the Prealpi that you can see from Milan and from Como. And those are areas that Leonardo certainly would have traveled to repeatedly when he was in Milan, because he was interested in these canal projects that were being expanded at that point, still in Milan, to connect them to the lakes to the north and to the Po to the south. And so he's interested in all of that, and we've got lots of drawings of the mountains with very specific, features of the various peaks that you can see. They've been identified. You can sort of compare photographs to his drawings and identify exactly what he's looking at. It looks like many of those drawings that were produced, he was inspired by the Alps, a beautiful sort of geography and terrain. It seems like many of those drawings that were produced in his first years in Milan carry over into some of his later works. There is also a detail of a bridge in the back of the Mona Lisa. And there's also a detail of a very specific geographic formation of what look like little treeless mountains kind of in the middle ground. And there is a stretch of land very close to Figline Valdarno, which is called the Balze. And it's been suggested that those, because they're so rare and unique, it's almost like he's combining a little bit of what he loved looking at the mountains up in the Alps. He's combining a little bit of the topography that he loves here in Tuscany, and he's kind of blending it together into this fictive environment. I can understand why everyone wants to say this is where it was painted, and even Martin Kemp went out to he's going out to these villas and he's looking for that view. They never found the view. I don't know if the view is able to be found or whether it's something of a experiment on Leonardo's own part, for his own right. They care about the face; they're not going to care about the background. Let me have fun with this background. Let me see what I can do, to produce a painting within the painting. I don't know anything about Bobbio. I don't know anything about Figline. I don't know anything about the Vignomaggio and Greve in Chianti. I tend to think that those are maybe the questions that we get stuck on. Maybe there are better questions that we could be asking ourselves. But that tends to keep the enthusiasm going. And every once in a while, there's always like a headline here in an Italian newspaper that we found something connected to Leonardo. So it never gets old, and I think people are always trying to add to the story. And in that case, I welcome any proposals for locations. I'll go out there in the car. I'll take a look. I'm sure it's beautiful countryside anyway, even if you don't find the landscape of the Mona Lisa. But that's some people have made this their mission. Their life and mission is to really go out and sort of find. The other one is the early landscape of the Santa Maria della Neve up on the Monte Albano. People have been going up and down that hiking range for years, looking for the specific view, which shows that relationship of the Fucecchio swamp to I forget the name of that little town that he's got in the middle ground. But no one's ever found it, so maybe it exists, maybe it doesn't.
Thank you.
Very good. So anyone else on the Zoom want to talk to us? Wave at us or unmute? What about the room? The room's been very quiet this evening. Oh, we got a couple. I'll just get the back first.
I can talk loud. Is this necessary? I can. Oh, for the Zoomers. Okay. I'm not quite sure how to word this. Given the immensity of the work by Giorgio Vasari and all of the biographies and how much respect he had for Leonardo, what are your thoughts of there perhaps being the battle scene behind his frescoes in the Great Hall? I know there have been recent sort of scientific things done, maybe a little hole drilled. And it just seems like in this day and age, it would be easier to maybe find that out for sure. And why has the work stopped?
For others listening, this question is reference to the battle piece, the Battle of Anghiari, that was begun by Leonardo in the Sala Grande of Palazzo Vecchio. That work, together with everything else in the room, is sort of frozen in time when we have the return of the Medici. This was a room to basically double down on the fact that Florence was a republic. The Medici had obtained too much power for themselves. They were de facto dictators in the republic, and following that particular exile, they want to make sure that no one can sort of do that again. And so there's a redrafting of the Florentine Constitution. There's a construction of a lower house of representatives, if you like. And I think that that's every male citizen between the age of 18 and whatever. And there's about 2,000 of them. And they have to get at least 500 of these people in one room at the same time. So the new meeting hall is inspired by the great meeting hall of the Doge's Palace in Venice. It's constructed in those years, and the first decorative programs commissioned from Michelangelo and Leonardo are really at the tail end of this project. The Medici come back, and it's kind of a turbulent history, but the dust settles with Cosimo, and we know that he is using that room as barracks for his soldiers. And we actually have a document which says that the Guardaroba has to order from a Florentine carpenter planks of wood to construct an armature to cover the horses of Leonardo so that they don't get ruined in the situation of the room being used as barracks. So if they had cared enough about the horses to cover them and try to protect them in that period, Vasari, having this broad intervention on the space, potentially had the ability to preserve that work behind his own workshop's murals. They had to raise the height of the ceiling by about 7 braccia. So there's a lot of engineering going on with the wall. One of the other funny documents that we have related to that project is that the tiling that was ordered, in terms of its quantity, does not make any sense. Like, you could tile the wall, the floor over 100 times with the amount of tile that's sort of brought in for this room. And it's been supposed that those are not tiles to floor, but tiles to build a false wall, protect an image underneath. So that sort of drill hole that you have heard about, that was an attempt to assess whether or not organic materials could be located in the space that was detected between the murals of Vasari and this underlying wall. They had a sensational headline saying that they discovered lamp black pigment on the wall behind, which seemed encouraging until you understand that lamp black is a pigment produced from the soot of candle smoke, like in a retort. You know, I mean, like, if you have candles going in that room, you're going to have lamp black on the wall. It's also a pigment that would have been used by every other artist in Florence at that time. So it doesn't connect to Leonardo or the work specifically. Maurizio Seracini is the figure who has been trying to apply modern diagnostic techniques to seeing through that wall non-invasively to come up with an answer, yes or no. And one of my professors, Rab Hatfield, worked very closely with him to go over the documents. I put his publication, Finding Leonardo, on the piano if you want to take a look at it. And that is a summation of his study. What is the probability that there's actually something there to find? And it's a short book, so you can read it in a weekend. It's one of the mysteries, one of the more Indiana Jones-ish mysteries of Leonardo.
Okay, one more.
There is a standard in Vasari's painting that has the words cerca trova, and that is plaster of the original fresco. It was not painted on afterwards. So it appears that Vasari himself, or in his studio, had that message left on the wall. That is true.
This is a question about the Annunciation of Uffizi. I took a guided tour of a church of San Bartolomeo a Montoliveto, and I was told that the Annunciation was painted for that church, and the landscape is the landscape we can still look at outside the church. Is it true?
I've heard, yeah, that there's a sort of a seascape, there's a port, and there's rising mountains in the background. There's something of the garden, which is a symbol of virgin purity, that was developed largely by Leonardo, it said, because he knew that this something would delight the friars in the convent of the intended, positioning of the work of art. There was also another painting that was made with a small predella that seems to be of the same compositional type, and I don't remember if that's Lorenzo di Credi, but there's a little bit of confusion over whether or not that landscape specifically has anything to do with the location. The garden definitely does. But it's sort of a seaport beyond that I don't think corresponds to the location.
Yeah, yes, just the cypress trees. Thank you.
And they're identifiable by species. You see all these trees very, very clearly.
Okay. Do we have anyone else who's itching to get into the conversation on the Zoom? No, in the room? I think we're coming towards a conclusion. Thank you very much indeed, Jeremy. And Zoomers, enjoy a glass of wine at home. It's the right time of day wherever you are, because we in the room are now going to go through to the other room for a nice glass of Frescobaldi, our current wine partners. And see you all next Wednesday for Shelley in Tuscany, both Mark and the dramatic monologue. All right, thank you. Thank you, and thank you
everyone. Thanks for joining us.